It had been with some trepidation that the siblings from Tythal had taken the Varshan woman into their company. Banditry was far from uncommon among the vagabond tribes of the sands, and it was that fact that set Sung against the proposition of allowing strangers to accompany their caravan. However, after the girl had promised Nan-Hay that her tribe would reward them for her safe return, the tradeswoman had advocated on her behalf. Her greed tended to triumph over her brother's caution in such matters, and this instance was no exception. Cyrus certainly hoped the stranger's tribe would be able to pay the merchants. He did not doubt that the traders of Tythal would take her as capital if they were refused their reward. As for the information Cyrus had been promised for leading the woman to his employer, she had not known much about the beast that had attacked her. However, she had known of a sorcerer, Thelasama, living in the area, who seemed a likely culprit. A reclusive sort, dwelling in a tower amid the sands to the west of Janaba, atop which rested a great red gem, which the nomads reckoned must be the heart of an ancient Titan that ruled over this desert before the ages of man. Cyrus was almost certain that such claims were superstitious nonsense, but fascinating nonsense at the very least. To his mind, the important bit was that the wizard had entered into a feud with the rulers of Janaba a few months prior, and had apparently set all manner of twisted beasts loose upon the road to frighten away travelers and dry up the flow of commerce to the city. The caravan had been lucky not to have crossed paths with such creatures earlier, but if what the girl said was true, it could mean there was still trouble ahead for them yet. Strictly speaking, these affairs were none of Cyrus's business. His inquiries had been driven by curiosity more than anything else. Cyrus was certainly no slayer of dark beasts or hunter of malevolent magicians, not without some kind of personal stake in the matter at least. As far as he was concerned, the sorcerer could continue his feud against Janaba, and he would just be sure to tread a little more carefully when their caravan left the city. In contrast to the warlock's relative indifference, both of the merchant siblings had been delighted when the sorcerer had brought them the news of Janaba's troubles. "With so few merchants reaching the gates of Janaba, this may be a more profitable venture than my last by an incredible margin," Sung had exclaimed to his sister. The seasoned trader's eyes were alight with ambition of a higher station his family could achieve with the wealth they would extort from the desperate city. That was something a part of Cyrus admired about the fat man. In the short time he had known the two merchants of the East, he had learned that their father had been raised in poverty. Sung and his sister had grown up barely wanting for anything, and if Sung had his way, his children would stand eye to eye with the princes of Tythal themselves. The sorcerer had no doubt that had Sung been born in his homeland, by this point in his life the rotund tradesman would have either become a master of the occult arts or a corpse. Some would have condemned the man's rampant avarice, but the sorcerer knew there were more sinister things to pursue in this life than gold. Scarson was less amused by the gleaming eyes of the merchant, and was glaring at his employer in clear and evident disgust. Every one of the Northmen present was nearly as fond of gold as the merchant. There was not one of them who had not partaken in the raids of their people, not one of them who had failed to kill in the name of plunder and trinkets. Greed was not Scarson's issue with the fat man, and so Cyrus wondered what had sparked the enmity in his eyes. As the sorcerer was debating whether or not to venture to ask his question, he noticed Nan-Hay. She was wearing a more subdued smile than her brother, and her eyes, like his, seemed to gleam. But there was something to them which only Cyrus had seemed to notice. She'd had an idea of her own, but had not given voice to it. The Elentrian quite forgot his question for the warrior, as he shot his employer a quizzical look, to which her sly grin widened a bit more. For several moments she gazed ahead at the crenellated white stone walls that surrounded the still slightly distant Janaba, the heavy gate by which they would soon enter the city, the ivory dome of the great palace at the heart of the city, and the azure spires that rose up from behind the walls, upon which, Hierophants and scholars observed the movements and intricacies of their sacred moon each night. I was thinking that we might do well to assist the lords of Janaba with their troublesome neighbor. Nanhe's suggestion surprised both the warlock and her brother, neither of whom had expected such a generous proposition to come from her mouth. Oddly enough, it was Scarson who first guessed at what she was thinking, for their minds had, in a rare occurrence, been traveling along similar paths. You think they'll reward us for killing their warlock? And that gem he has sounds like one hell of a prize as well, the Northman surmised with a grimace. He had been contemplating the chances of himself and his fighters against the sorcerer and his collection of abominable beasts. With 10 men, the odds were not in his favor. Even so, it was a tempting endeavor. While I do not doubt that there is a sizable bounty on the witch's head, I do not think that it would be wise to risk our protectors on such an errand. Scarson, I must apologize to you and your men, but they are not so numerous that I would see them put to such a dangerous task. Of course, Sung was aware that the profits they were bound to acquire in Janaba would be more than ample enough to hire a few new guards. His concern was that if the Northmen did manage to claim a great bounty on the sorcerer's head, who's to say they would share the riches with their employers instead of abandoning the caravan with their newly acquired wealth? I was of the opinion that our own sorcerer might mitigate the risks of such an endeavor. After we've sold as much merchandise as we can, I am certain that we will be able to entice the lords of Janaba to hire our very capable escorts to deal with their little squabble for an even more generous fee than their typical bounty. Why, we have even been so fortunate as to acquire a guide, one who has claimed to me that when she has her bearings, she knows her way through the desert as well as any of her people. It would be a shame to allow the good will we have shown her to go unrepaid, either by another of her tribe or by herself, if we do not find them in Janaba. The merchant chose her words carefully as she surveyed Kyrus, Scarson, Sung, and finally the woman of the desert, walking well out of earshot alongside the slaves, the latter of whom had the wounds on her face bandaged, and remained blissfully unaware of the cost that accepting the help of the traders would incur. Kyrus paused upon hearing this suggestion. After a moment he gave a small, thoughtful, yet subdued nod of agreement. In contrast, the warrior from the cold north's harsh face hardened into a look of disdain when it was suggested that his warriors would need the help of Kyrus to hunt down another warlock. Yet the fat merchant, in spite of his inexperience, had been correct in that Scarson and his 9 followers were not much of a force on their own. Hunting down a witch, especially one who dabbled in the creation of profane monsters, would be a foolhardy task with just his own men. Scarson eventually gave a slow yet reluctant nod to the idea. Not an enthusiastic agreement, but a grudging acknowledgment of the unavoidable practical aspects of the situation. He glowered in the sorcerer's direction when he spoke again. Perhaps, but I'll make damn sure to have a man ready to stick a sword in his back in case he tries to turn tail or decides his fellow witch would make a better partner than us. The emphatic statement did not elicit much of a reaction from the warlock present, who, after their conversation the night before, was well aware of the extent of Scarson's distrust towards him. Sung, however, seemed suitably impressed by his sister's initiative. While he could certainly see risks in such a plan, it seemed they were reasonable risks to take, considering the value the lords of Janaba would no doubt place on seeing their city open to the outside world again. Why, they were all but guaranteed to be showered in riches if they played their cards right. He assessed the city's wealth once more, as he gazed towards the engraved gates of Janaba, which bore silver emblems of devotion to their goddess, and the expensive optical devices that rested upon many of the great blue and white spires near the heart of the city, so as to better view their precious moon and its beloved children, the stars. These spectacles, to which the caravan drew ever closer, spoke for themselves, and brought a broad, ugly grin to the fat man's face, one that even Kyrus found just a bit unsettling. The city itself was a marvelous sight up close, at least to the eyes of the Elentrian. The deep blues and pristine white that painted its residences and towers were unlike anything he had seen in his homeland, a land where most of the grading color for architecture had fallen into disrepair or sunk into the muddy waters. As strange as the sight from outside the walls was, nothing could have prepared him for the streets within. The city's interior was not as pristine as the outer walls would have suggested, but to the sorcerer it seemed as though it was when contrasted with his homeland. Many dusky-skinned commoners walked the streets with their backs straight and their eyes up under the light of an afternoon sun. A far cry from the sight of malformed men and women scurrying through their rain-drenched hovels beneath a gloomy sky, moving swiftly, keeping their statures hunched and their eyes fixed to the ground, lest they attract the attention of one of the witch lords that ruled over them. The guards here all wore a blue or white tunic beneath their silver breastplate, which were themselves marked with an image of the moon in different phases, as what appeared to be a somewhat esoteric signifier of rank. But what was more striking about them to the sorcerer's eye was that they all appeared to be relatively subdued. Not a single one of the commoners in the street met with a lash for milling about, despite the fact that several seemed to be doing just that. The buildings all looked quite sturdy as well, with evidently none of them having been cobbled together from straw and half-rotten timber. Only the towers of the witch lords were as advanced in their construction, and those dreaded buildings would look quite out of place here. Those whose birth had not confined them to such a forlorn land were less impressed by the interior of the city. It was not remarkable in comparison to Tythal or its sister cities, where the palaces of the merchant princes were encrusted with jewels and decorated with adornments of gold. Most of the peasants were thinner than they should be, a sign of the hard times that had struck the city thanks to its feud with the warlock, Thel-Lasama. Most of these low-born masses were clad in simple white garments, well suited in their design to desert life. Even the slaves of the merchants in their yellow and red cloth attire, similar to their masters, were better dressed than the commoners here, something which brought an amused smirk to Sung's lips. The fact that any of his slaves would have traded their more expensive attire in an instant in exchange for the freedom of those their masters scoffed at was not something of importance to the merchant, if such a thought even crossed his mind at all. Sung had wasted no time in making his way to the market alongside the lion's share of the slaves, Skarsen, and most of his bodyguards. It had taken him a modest bribe at the gates of Janaba to convince the guards to allow the Elentrian entrance alongside them, despite the fact that Nan-He had the foresight to hide his staff in one of the carts underneath a few bags of spices. The attempt had been worth the minute or so spent on hiding the staff. Nevertheless, Kyrus's unsettling appearance and the dark reputation of his people had given the guards reason enough to label him warlock regardless. Sung was eager to begin recovering from the small initial loss upon their arrival, and sent the sorcerer, along with Nan-He, one of the Northmen by the name of Vargas, who was the eldest of the warriors and favored an axe, and a pair of slaves to secure their accommodation. It would not do to have Kyrus scaring away the customers with his presence. Nan-He could have afforded the usual price for any of the inns of Janaba, but with the scarcity of travelers able to reach the city, it was easy for someone as sharp as her to haggle down the most luxurious inn she could find to a rock-bottom price. And with so many available rooms, Nan-He ensured that not even the slaves would have to endure the discomfort of sleeping in the stables that night. She knew her brother would complain about the expense later, but where was the harm in indulging the poor wretches who had spent the last weeks trekking on foot through a scorching desert in their service? "I will tell my brother that they will work harder with a good night's rest," the tradeswoman told Kyrus and the tribal woman from the desert as the three sat on silk cushions by one of the inn's more private and ornate tables, located in a small lounging area. The statement had been prompted by the curious look Cyrus had worn upon his face when they had sat down, but that had not been what he was wondering. Rather, Cyrus was unsure whether her generosity was born from a spark of genuine kindness, or an extension of Nanhe's manipulative tendencies. He suspected that she herself might not know either. While Cyrus was contemplating this, the trader from Tythal turned her attention to the nomad of the desert. Now, dear, before you go searching for your clan, I feel obligated to refresh your memory of the rewards you assured me your people would be willing to bestow upon us in exchange for your return. You see, the truth is, I am in dire need of a favor from your kin, and it would be most regrettable if in your admirable enthusiasm to reunite with your people, the thought of our payment slipped your mind. Why, if such a terrible misunderstanding were to occur, I might have no choice but to send Cyrus here to gently remind you of your obligation. It was certainly the most polite and gentle way that Cyrus had ever heard anyone threaten someone, and judging by the pale look the dusky-skinned nomad now wore, that misunderstanding Nanhe had been concerned about had come very close to occurring. The sorcerer was almost impressed enough not to scowl slightly when the merchant talked about setting him on the woman's trail as if he were some manner of fell spirit. He held his tongue, however, and let the woman he had rescued in the desert respond. I'll be sure not to forget. She wasn't as eloquent as Nanhe, and in spite of her far sturdier and better conditioned build, felt ill at ease around the ruthless tradeswoman. What was worse, she had seen the witch-man's magic reduce a beast that had torn through her people's camp and flung her about like sand before a great wind to a rotting pile of meat. She did not wish to spend a moment longer in the company of either of them, but she wanted to make an enemy of them even less. So when she left the inn with a nod, it was with the full intent of bringing her clan's patriarch to negotiate the price of her return with the foreigners. Oh, don't look so sour. It's not as if I'll actually need to sick you on the poor thing. The threat was more than enough. Really, I'm quite impressed by the effect you have on people. Very useful when they're thinking of walking out on a deal. You know, whatever you did to that monster last night gave her quite a fright. She made me swear on the Golden Sun not to tell you her name when we first met. I was surprised that she even knew what god we worshipped in the Gleaming Cities. The trader from Tythal addressed Cyrus again after the nomad had left the inn. She was wearing a broad smile that announced that she was quite pleased by how her discussion with the woman of Varsha had gone. Cyrus shrugged. To an extent he appreciated the ruthlessness that his employer had shown, but at the same time he had no desire to harm or frighten the woman who had already been through quite an ordeal. Speaking of which, I wanted to talk to you about this Thellasama all the locals seem so frightened of, Nanhe announced as her mind refocused towards the center of her scheming. If it were some outlaw I'd wanted dead, I'd trust Scarson and his warriors to handle it, if the town guard couldn't. Our caravan was attacked by bandits not long after we left Tythal, and before we found you. I watched those warriors from Akal cut down well-armed and armored grown men like children. She shuddered briefly at the memory. For all her calculated ruthlessness, uncontrolled violence was not something her well-to-do life had left her accustomed to. The concept of it never seemed to bother her, but the reality had been rather jarring. Her show of weakness was only momentary, as she soon continued speaking as if she had not hesitated at all. But magic, from what little I know of it, is never so predictable. I suspect that it will take me a few days to gain an audience with the Emir of the city and find out how much he will pay for Thellasama's head. And my brother will be busy selling the merchandise we brought with us. Can I trust you will look into this warlock and pass your appraisal of what you discover on to me? Nanhe requested of the sorcerer in her service as her smile dimmed and her face grew a good deal more serious. While potentially extremely profitable, she was aware this was no casual undertaking she was set upon. To cross this sorcerer, who was able to terrorize an entire city, was bound to have consequences if he survived, even if she would be safely waiting in the city, while others were sent by her and her brother to confront him. I was thinking of doing so already, though I suspect the locals' knowledge of him will be as much rumor and superstition as truth. The witch lords of my homeland love spreading grand stories of their power to keep the populace sufficiently terrified and obedient. I doubt this one is any different. Kyrus stated this with confidence, for he knew, and from his conversation the night before he suspected Scarson also knew, that the chief desire of every sorcerer in every land was the exact same. Regardless, the entire caravan had a busy few days ahead of them in Janaba. So I've decided to release Chapter 3 a bit early due to the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. I hope you all enjoyed Chapter 3 of The Sands Beneath the Moon, and as always, any feedback is appreciated. Leave a like if you like the video, and subscribe if you want to be notified of future releases. Thank you all for listening.